There are moments in life that pass unnoticed, ordinary days that feel no different from any other, moments where nothing seems out of place, nothing seems wrong, and yet sometimes behind that normality something else exists, something hidden so deeply that no one around can see it, even when they are standing just a few steps away from it. In the city of Cleveland, Ohio, life moved the same way it always had, streets filled with people going about their routines, neighbors passing each other without a second thought, houses lined up side by side, each one appearing no different from the next, each one holding its own quiet story behind closed doors, stories that most people would never question because everything looked normal. And that is what made it so easy to miss. Because in a place where nothing seems unusual, where everything blends into the background, the idea that something disturbing could exist so close feels almost impossible to believe, and yet sometimes, the most unsettling truths are not hidden far away but right in front of us, concealed not by distance but by familiarity. In April of 2003, a 16-year-old girl named Amanda Berry left her job and began walking home, a simple routine, something she had likely done before, something that should have ended the same way it always did, with her returning safely with nothing out of the ordinary. But that day she never made it home. At first it was confusion, then concern, and then something heavier, something that began to grow with each passing hour, because when someone disappears without explanation, time itself becomes something different, every minute stretching longer, every unanswered call becoming louder, every moment without answers adding weight to the silence. Search efforts began quickly, family members, friends, and authorities all trying to piece together what had happened, where she had gone, who she might have been with, but there was no clear answer, no immediate clue that could explain her disappearance, only questions that led to more questions. Days passed, then weeks, and slowly the situation began to shift from a search into something more uncertain, because when time moves forward without answers, hope begins to change, not disappear, but transform into something more fragile, something that holds on despite the lack of evidence. But Amanda Berry was not the only one. Within the same city, within the same environment, another young girl, Gina De Jesus, also disappeared, her story following a similar pattern, leaving behind the same kind of questions, the same kind of silence, creating a situation that felt too similar to ignore, yet still without a clear explanation that could connect the two events. Two disappearances. Same city. No answers. And still, nothing pointed directly to what had happened, nothing that clearly revealed where they were, or who had taken them, or how something like this could happen without anyone seeing it. The investigation continued, leads were followed, possibilities were explored, but without solid evidence, every path seemed to end the same way, with uncertainty, with the same unanswered questions returning again and again. And as time passed, the world outside continued to move forward, people continued their lives, routines continued, the city remained the same, and yet somewhere within it, something had changed, something that no one could see, something that remained hidden in a way that made it almost impossible to detect. Because while everyone was searching, while everyone was asking where they had gone, no one realized something far more disturbing. They had never left. Not the city. Not the neighborhood. Not even the street. They were still there. Close enough to hear the world outside. Close enough to know that life was continuing without them. Hidden behind a door that no one had reason to question. And as the years began to pass, what started as a disappearance slowly became something else, something deeper, something that would remain hidden not for days, not for weeks, but for years, turning this story into something far more disturbing than anyone could have imagined at the beginning. Because this was not a case of someone vanishing without a trace. This was a case of someone being there, and no one realizing it. Time did not stop after their disappearance, it moved forward the way it always does, quietly, steadily, without waiting for answers, and as the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, the search for Amanda Berry and Gina De Jesus slowly began to lose the urgency it once had, not because people stopped caring, but because there were no new leads, no clear direction, nothing that could push the investigation forward in a meaningful way. Families held on, refusing to accept the silence as an ending, continuing to hope, continuing to believe that somehow, somewhere there would be an answer, that one day a call would come, or a door would open, or something would change, but as time passed, that hope became heavier, more difficult to carry, because it had nothing to hold on to except the idea that they were still out there. But they were not out there. They were inside a house. A house that did not stand out, a house that looked like every other house on the street, a place that people walked past without thinking, without questioning, without imagining that anything unusual could be happening behind its walls, because from the outside everything appeared normal. And that was the illusion that allowed everything to continue. The man who lived there, Ariel Castro, was not someone who immediately drew attention. He was known in the area, familiar enough to be recognized, someone who moved through daily life without raising suspicion, someone who blended into the environment in a way that made him almost invisible in plain sight. Inside that house, however, reality was completely different. Time did not move the same way. Days were not measured by routines or schedules, but by something far more confined, something controlled, something isolated from the outside world in a way that made it feel distant, even though it was only separated by walls, by doors, by barriers that no one on the outside thought to question. Years began to pass. Not days. Not months. Years. And during that time, life outside continued as if nothing had happened. Neighbors lived their lives, people passed by, conversations took place. Ordinary moments unfolded just a few steps away from something that no one could see, something that no one suspected. The investigation, once intense and active, became quieter, not completely stopped, but no longer driven by new evidence, because without leads, without clear direction, even the most determined efforts begin to shift into something more distant, something that remains open but unresolved. For many, the case became something that faded into the background, a story remembered, but no longer actively followed, a question without an answer that slowly became part of the past, even though the reality of it was still very much present. And this is what made it so disturbing. Because while the world moved on, while attention shifted elsewhere, the truth remained exactly where it had always been, unchanged, hidden in a place that no one thought to look, a place that existed within reach, within sight, yet completely unseen. There were moments, small details, things that might have seemed unusual if viewed closely, but nothing that stood out enough to force a deeper look, nothing that clearly revealed what was happening, because sometimes, the absence of obvious signs is what allows something to remain hidden the longest. And so the years continued, one after another, quietly, unnoticed, until eventually something changed. Not gradually, not over time, but in a single moment. A moment that would break the silence that had lasted for years. A moment that would turn everything from hidden to undeniable. At some point, time itself begins to feel different, not because it actually slows down, but because of what fills it, because when days repeat without change, when the same walls remain, the same silence returns again and again, time stops being something that moves forward and instead becomes something that simply exists, stretching, heavy, endless, without a clear sense of beginning or end. Inside that house, years were not marked by calendars or seasons in the way the outside world understands them. They were marked by routine, by repetition, by the quiet passing of days that blended into each other until they were no longer separate moments, but a continuous experience, something that could not easily be measured, only endured. Outside, the world continued to change. People moved. Neighbors came and went. The city evolved. But inside, nothing changed. And that contrast is what makes this case so deeply unsettling, because while everything outside moved forward, what was happening inside remained frozen in a reality that no one could see, no one could hear, and no one could fully imagine. There were moments when sounds from the outside would pass through, distant voices, footsteps, fragments of normal life, reminders that the world still existed just beyond reach, close enough to be felt, but not close enough to be touched, and those moments created a strange connection between two completely different realities existing in the same place at the same time. For Amanda Berry and Gina De Jesus, survival was not a single act, not one decision, but something that had to be repeated every day, something that required endurance, patience, and the ability to hold on to the idea that one day something might change, even when there was no clear sign that it ever would. And as time passed, the situation became more complex, because what had begun as a disappearance was no longer just about being missing, it had become something deeper, something that involved adaptation, resilience, and the ability to exist within circumstances that were never meant to be lived through. Years went by. Not quietly in the sense of being unnoticed, but quietly in the sense that nothing from the outside interrupted them, nothing broke through the walls that separated what was happening inside from what was happening outside, and that separation allowed everything to continue far longer than anyone could have imagined. The investigation, once active and urgent, had long since slowed, leads had been exhausted, possibilities explored, and without new information, the case remained open, but distant, part of a list of unresolved disappearances that carried more questions than answers. But inside that house, the reality of the case had never become distant. It was immediate, constant, unavoidable. And over time, the ability to survive became tied to small things, moments, thoughts, the idea of holding on to something beyond the present, something that could exist outside of what was happening, because without that, time itself becomes too heavy to carry. At the same time, the environment remained unchanged, the same structure, the same isolation, the same separation from the outside world, creating a space where everything that happened within it remained contained, hidden, removed from visibility in a way that made it almost impossible to detect from the outside. And yet, despite that isolation, the house was not separate from the world. It was part of it. People walked past it. Cars drove by it. Life moved around it. All while something else existed inside. Something no one saw. Something no one expected. And this is where the case becomes more than just a story of disappearance, because it forces a realization that is difficult to accept. The idea that something so extreme could exist so close to everyday life without being recognized, without being interrupted, without being fully understood until much later. There were no clear signs that forced attention, no single moment that immediately revealed everything, and that absence of obvious evidence is what allowed the situation to continue, because when something does not stand out, it becomes part of the background, part of what people assume is normal. But normal can be misleading. Normal can hide things. Normal can create a sense of safety that prevents deeper questions from being asked. And in this case, that sense of normality was exactly what allowed everything to remain hidden for so long. As the years continued, the situation inside the house became a reality that existed entirely on its own terms, separate from the outside world, yet physically located within it, a contradiction that made it difficult to fully understand even after it was eventually revealed. Because understanding something like this is not just about knowing what happened, it is about understanding how it was able to happen, how it was able to continue, and how it remained unseen despite being so close to everything else. And that understanding does not come easily. It requires looking beyond assumptions, beyond appearances, beyond the idea that what we see is always what exists, because sometimes, the most important details are the ones that are not visible at all. Inside that house, time continued to move in its own way, separate from everything else, creating a reality that was disconnected from the outside world in every way except location. And that disconnect is what made it possible for the situation to last as long as it did. But no situation like this remains unchanged forever. At some point something shifts, something breaks, something interrupts the pattern. And when that happens, everything that was hidden begins to surface, not slowly, not gradually, but all at once, in a way that cannot be ignored, cannot be contained, and cannot be undone. And that moment was coming. There comes a point in every hidden story where silence can no longer hold, where something shifts, something small at first, almost unnoticeable, but strong enough to break the pattern that has existed for so long, and in this case, that moment did not arrive as a gradual change, it came suddenly, unexpectedly, like a crack forming in something that had been held together for years. By 2013, nearly a decade had passed since Amanda Berry first disappeared, a decade filled with unanswered questions, fading headlines, and a world that had slowly moved on, accepting uncertainty as the only available explanation. Yet inside that same city, inside that same neighborhood, the reality of what had happened was still unfolding, still hidden, still waiting for the moment when it would finally be seen. And that moment began with something simple. A chance. An opportunity. A brief opening in a pattern that had remained controlled for years. Because sometimes, it does not take a large event to change everything, sometimes it takes a single moment, a single decision, something that seems small on its own, but becomes powerful enough to alter the entire course of what follows. On that day, Amanda Berry found that moment. Not because everything suddenly became easier, not because the situation had changed in a way that made escape simple, but because for the first time in years, there was an opening, a break in the control that had defined everything up to that point, a moment where action became possible. And she took it. What followed was not planned in the way people might imagine, not carefully structured or guaranteed to succeed, but immediate, urgent, driven by the understanding that this moment might not come again, that hesitation could mean losing the only chance she had. She moved toward the door. Toward something that had always been there, yet had never been within reach in the same way. And when she reached it, when she realized that this time it could open, that this time there was no barrier stopping her, everything changed in an instant. Because the difference between being trapped and being free can sometimes be as small as a single unlocked door. She stepped outside. For the first time in years. Into a world that had continued without her, a world that had moved forward while she remained hidden within it, and that moment, that first step, was not just movement, it was a transition between two completely different realities. But stepping outside was only the beginning. Because freedom is not immediate when no one knows your story, when the world around you has no context for what has just happened, when you have to make others understand something that feels almost impossible to explain in a single moment. She called for help. Loudly. Desperately. Because after years of silence, that was the only thing that could break through, the only thing that could bring attention, the only way to turn something hidden into something seen. Neighbors heard her. At first, confusion. Then concern. Because what they were hearing did not match what they expected, it did not fit into the normal pattern of the neighborhood, and that difference is what made them respond, what made them come closer, what made them realize that something was happening that required attention. And when they saw her, when they understood even a small part of what she was saying, the situation shifted immediately, because what had been hidden for years was now visible, no longer contained, no longer silent, no longer part of the background. Authorities were called. And within minutes, everything that had remained unseen for so long began to unfold at a speed that no one could have predicted. Police arrived at the house, not yet fully aware of what they were about to encounter, not yet understanding the full scale of what had been hidden inside, but aware enough to know that something serious had taken place, something that required immediate attention. And when they entered, when they began to see beyond the surface, beyond the appearance of an ordinary home, the reality of the situation became impossible to ignore. Because this was not just a missing person case being resolved. This was something much bigger. Something that had existed for years. Something that had remained hidden in plain sight. Inside the house they found more than one person. Michelle Knight, Gina De Jesus, still there. Still inside the same place where no one had thought to look closely enough. The moment that followed was not just about discovery, it was about realization, the understanding that everything that had been assumed, everything that had been believed about the case, had been incomplete, that the truth had been far closer than anyone had imagined. For the city, for the families, for everyone who had followed the case, this moment changed everything, because it replaced years of uncertainty with a reality that was both shocking and undeniable. They had been found, alive, after years of being hidden just steps away from ordinary life. And in that moment, the story that had once been defined by disappearance became something else entirely, something that would force people to reconsider what they thought they understood about safety, about visibility, about how something so significant could remain unseen for so long. Because the truth was no longer hidden. It was out in the open. And nothing would ever be the same again. The moment the truth came out, everything changed, not slowly, not over time, but instantly, as if years of silence had been replaced by a single overwhelming wave of reality that no one could ignore, because what had once been a missing person's case, something uncertain and distant, had suddenly become something real, something visible, something that forced everyone to confront the fact that the unimaginable had been happening in plain sight for years. News spread quickly, faster than anything that had come before, because this was not just an update, not just a development in an old case, it was a complete reversal of everything people thought they knew, a story that had once been about loss now becoming one about survival, about endurance, about the discovery of something that had remained hidden for far too long. For the families, the moment was beyond anything that could be easily described, because after years of not knowing, years of searching, years of holding on to hope without evidence, they were suddenly faced with a reality they had dreamed of but could never fully expect, the return of someone they had not given up on, despite everything that had suggested they might never come back. But even in that moment of relief there was something else, something deeper, the understanding that while they had been found, the years that had passed could not be undone, that time, once lost, does not return, and that the experience of those years would remain, shaping everything that came after. For the city of Cleveland, the case became more than just a story, it became a question, a reflection of how something so extreme could exist without being recognized, how a house could stand among others, unchanged, unquestioned, while inside it, a completely different reality was unfolding, one that no one outside could see. People began to look differently at what they thought they understood, at the idea of normal, at the assumption that what appears ordinary must be safe, because this case showed that normal can sometimes hide things that are anything but ordinary, that familiarity can create a kind of blindness that prevents deeper questions from being asked. And that realization stayed. Because once something like this is known, it changes perspective, it alters the way people see the world around them, not in a way that creates constant fear, but in a way that introduces awareness, the understanding that not everything is as simple as it appears. The legal process that followed focused on accountability, on ensuring that what had happened was addressed within the system, that responsibility was clearly established, and that the actions taken were recognized for what they were, not minimized, not overlooked, but fully acknowledged based on the evidence that had been uncovered. At the same time, the story continued to be told not only as a case but as a reminder of resilience, of survival, of the ability to endure even in circumstances that seem impossible, and while the details of what happened were difficult, the outcome carried a different kind of meaning, one that went beyond the events themselves. Because this was not only a story about what had been done, it was a story about what had been survived. And that difference matters. Because while the events themselves were defined by control and isolation, the ending was defined by something else, something stronger, something that broke through years of silence and brought everything into the light. For many, the case remains difficult to fully understand, not because the facts are unclear, but because the scale of it challenges the way people think about safety, about visibility, about how something can exist so close to everyday life without being noticed. And that is what gives this story its lasting impact, not only the events themselves but the questions it raises, the perspective it creates, and the understanding it leaves behind. Because in the end, this was not just a case about disappearance. It was a case about something being there all along, hidden, unseen, and finally, discovered.